Today we're going to discuss Unit 9, Part 1, the causes of World War II. We'll pay special attention to the causes of the war and then also get into Pearl Harbor, which eventually led the United States into war. World War II began in September of 1939, and Britain and France declared war on Germany following Germany's invasion of Poland. This was the trigger, but there were a number of events that led to World War II, including the conclusion of World War I itself and the Treaty of Versailles and how much it punished Germany. So the Treaty of Versailles, as we know and we studied a few months back, really put the blame on Germany for World War I. And as a result, their military was limited, they lost land. And this really sent Germany into a great economic depression because of how much they were limited and cut off from the rest of the world. So the people were very unhappy. They couldn't find jobs. They faced problems like starvation, homelessness. This really led them into a state of desperation where they were desperate for someone that would lead them out of this. And that person was Hitler. Adolf Hitler was elected in 1933, and he offered the people a way out of this depression. He started to build up the feeling of nationalism and what it's like to be German and what a German person is, and really characterize that. And he started to build up their military right away, which violated the Treaty of Versailles. But Britain and France kind of ignored this action, thinking back on how the Treaty of Versailles really was maybe a little too harsh, and thought maybe a strong Germany at this point would help to limit the growth of communism throughout Europe, because that was a major problem that they were facing during this time. So here's some events that led to the war. In addition to Hitler violating the Treaty of Versailles, he also joined with Benito Mussolini, who was the leader of Italy, and they made an alliance called the Rome-Berlin Axis, or the Axis powers. Mussolini is going to invade Ethiopia, trying to create that as part of his expansion of the Italian Empire in 1935, which is going to cause controversy within the rest of the world. Africa was this place where people just kind of took over, and Europe was starting to conquer it, and so taking over part of it would cause controversy not only in Africa, but also the other European nations that had settled there as well. As we spoke before, Hitler violated the Treaty of Versailles, which is going to cause some tension. He's going to continue to violate and violate and violate even after France and Britain say, after this you're done. And he's going to continue to say, okay, I'm done, and then continue to push through as if he doesn't care. So in the 1930s, he increased his army and weapons, and Germany's military was significantly limited by the Treaty of Versailles. So that directly violated it. He also wasn't allowed to expand on his land according to the Treaty of Versailles, so he's going to add Austria to his empire and take that over in 1938. He's going to continue to push through and take over more land and strengthen the size of his empire, and in early 1939 takes over Czechoslovakia. And at that point, France and Britain kind of put down an ultimatum and say, no more. If you continue to take over these lands, then we're going to have to push back. So what does Hitler do? In late 1939, he invades Poland, and that's going to be the major trigger to involve Germany in a war with France and Britain. Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. The Polish army was defeated within weeks. They weren't a very strong country, and his war tactic was very successful. They called it a blitzkrieg, or a lightning war. It was called this because it involved surprise attacks with armed forces and massive airstrikes, so kind of coming on them like lightning. So this sped up that process and ended up angering France and Britain. Soviet Union partners and takes over the eastern half of Poland on September 17th. So then the war begins. France and Britain can no longer ignore or pardon Hitler's actions after the invasion of Poland, because they had an agreement with Poland that if they were to be attacked, that they would partner with them and support them and aid them. So ultimately, this led the two countries into war with Germany. So a long path of Hitler continuing to violate the Treaty of Versailles, continuing to push through and conquer other nations, and eventually Britain and France realized that that Germany potentially limiting the spread of communism does not outweigh what Hitler was doing in Europe. We're going to move in to talk about a different section of the war. The war is in two different parts. One, a major part of it is in Europe, but we also have the Asian part, and that's how the Japanese get involved. So Japanese imperialism is the major cause behind their ideology and what led them into the attack on Pearl Harbor. After a series of economic failures, because that depression that we had also spread all throughout Europe and also Asia, attempted assassination of their leaders, and also anti-Japanese immigration policies in the West, also in the United States, showed that Japan really wanted to show that the East or Asia was the strongest country, and they wanted to dominate the Far East altogether. So they're going to turn to imperialism and start to try to do a military takeover of the regions that were surrounding them. They're going to move troops into China and also French Indochina, so that was lands that the U.S.'s ally, France, took over, and also they had a lot of trade relationships with that region, and the Japanese were trying to cut that off. So in response, Roosevelt demanded that Japanese remove troops and kind of offered an ultimatum where he was going to cut off oil supply to the Japanese if they didn't stop. This is ultimately going to push the Japanese to the point where they're going to invade Pearl Harbor, and when they invade Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, that's going to open up that area to them so that they can continue to expand. So what happened on December 7, 1941? The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, which is United States territory. They wanted to destroy as much of the U.S. naval fleet as possible to allow Japanese free reign in the Pacific. So that means that they would have open land to expand their empire. Hawaii is closer to Asia than it is to other parts of the world, definitely closer than to Europe. So that definitely was a resource for them. Just like 9/11, people were outraged by an attack on our own country. That doesn't happen very often. The other wars we had fought, world wars in recent times at this time, were not on our own land. So this was very striking to people. It killed over 2,000 people, and it's eventually the event that's going to lead the United States into joining the Allied side of the war with France and Britain. President Roosevelt is going to give a speech talking about how infamous this event is and how it was a surprise attack and how we had no clue it was coming, and that's going to continue to get the people on his side in going to war in World War II. Pearl Harbor, a lot of times they ran drills there to prepare the military, so it was a surprise attack. So this quote, "Air raid on Pearl Harbor, this is no drill," is what announced that this is what was happening. And here's President Roosevelt writing his famous speech, Day of Infamy. And here are some pictures of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Very devastating event in our nation's history, and it's something that the Japanese are sincerely disappointed in what they did, because in their culture, to surprise attack someone is shameful. So all the way around, this event is something that people look back on in a very negative way, and people even question the United States and did they really not know this was happening? So a lot of people relate it to 9/11, although 9/11 was a terrorist attack and this was pretty much an act of war. The experiences and that surprise feeling are very relatable.